Hello and welcome back to Inside Update, a show brought to you by InsideInvestigator.org. We are a nonprofit newsroom where we use the moral power of investigative journalism to root out corruption, which is an exciting job. I also believe that it carries us to all different kinds of topics, and today's is not a happy one generally. It's going to require a disclaimer up front. The investigation itself includes strong language, descriptions, and discussion of sexual assault and violence. So might not be suitable for all readers, but obviously this is a clean show. We're not going to be in here dropping quotes, but there might be some discussion or at least acknowledgement of these not so pleasant topics. So take that as you will. I appreciate you being here with us today. Despite it being a difficult topic, it is a very important one for our mission, for making Connecticut a better place to live. And to chat about his work, we have Brandon Whiting, investigative reporter. Brandon, how you doing today?
Good. How are you?
I am doing well. I am doing well. I'm excited to talk about this. This is an investigation that needed to make its way across attorneys' desks in the editing process. It's a like I said, it's difficult, but it's important, and it starts with someone who is willing and able to speak up when they have been shut out of a lot of other opportunities. Tell us about Keith and how this story came to be.
Keith is he's a powerhouse. He is like when you're doing this job for so long, I don't want to denigrate anybody, but it's more often than not, it can be difficult working with sources. A lot of people, they don't really understand what we do or, how we get our work done, or, they'll send us in a tip and they think we have powers that are like superior to anybody else's, and they just throw us a cent on like a throwaway email or a phone number and be like, all right, I told you about an issue, now go find it. It's like, oh, okay. But no, Keith, he was really willing to put himself out there. He works for the Office of Victim Services, so that is through the state. He works for the state, and he works under the umbrella of the judicial branch, and he wanted to make it, very clear to me and to put it out there, top of the story. I'm speaking for the story as a dad, not as a employee of the state, trying to cover his bases as much as he possibly can. But essentially, he was just sharing the story of his family and the struggles that they've had going through the criminal justice system. His daughter was allegedly sexually assaulted. We have to throw that in there because, according to the court of law, she wasn't, or if she was, they didn't prosecute it, I guess would probably be the most apt way of putting it in there. And this is a guy who obviously, he works in the court systems now as a victim services provider, which is essentially, I guess, if you don't really know what that is, it's kind of like, if you're accused of a crime and you can't afford a lawyer, then the state provides you with a public defendant. And this is kind of the opposite side of that. So if you are, the victim of an alleged crime and you're bringing a case to court, then Keith is the person that the state is providing to you to help you kind of navigate that process. But before that, he was a police officer and a detective for, I think, over 20 years or 30 years. I can't recall off the top of my head, but he's been around the block, essentially. He knows how criminal investigations are supposed to go. He knows how courtroom, how it's supposed to play out in a courtroom. And so it kind of made him very uniquely qualified, just in the case of telling this, tragic and very unfortunate story.
One of the things that stood out to me right from the get-go is, of course, that, disclaimer that he has to separate his professional life and his personal life. And, you do have to draw that line if you don't want to be uh, thought of as commingling that, or speaking for the state could really get someone into trouble. But that wealth of knowledge, having been a New Haven police detective for such a long time, really struck me as, we get a lot of tips about people who say, hey, something happened, and I guess tongue in cheek a little bit to your point, hey, can you look into someone's bank account at Bank of America and let us know if they took money to do this horrible thing? And I'm like, no, we don't have that power.
Right.
But what I really appreciated about Keith, and it seems like it made your life easier, was that he came with all the receipts of phone calls and court documents. In other words, like, because he understood what was uh, important in a case, it made it easier to work with a reporter. And it certainly allowed us to get further down the road. We spent a huge amount of time screening information, right? I mean, that's a huge part of the job, is just making sure that everything that we are being told is true. And obviously, there are some things that are, the nature of the story is that they're in a black box, and that is, the driving force behind it. Um, but I always appreciate when we can work with people who have that. Um, how was that, I guess, different? It was emotionally charged, certainly talking to him. Did you feel like that was helpful or less helpful in trying to put together an investigation?
I mean, um, I was honestly kind of surprised just in the way that he was like, obviously a story of the, whenever you're telling the story of your daughter who was sexually assaulted, that is emotionally charged. But I honestly, I was very impressed by just how well put together Keith was through all of this. He's really coming from this from the point of he's told me several times, and I hope to his point that we were able to achieve that. He really didn't want this story to be centered on just his daughter. He's like, I want to use my daughter's story basically as a vehicle to kind of show the larger overall problem of the fact that victims just kind of don't really get the same respect or get the same rights as alleged perpetrators in the criminal justice system. That was the home he really wanted. That was a point he really wanted to hammer home. Of course, for me, and just I guess journalistically in general, I mean, but for me personally, I find it's the best way to drive home a larger point, is to use the human element, right? So obviously you can't tell that point without telling his daughter's story. But yeah, it was obviously he was emotional, but he was really that really seemed to be his main goal here, was just to be like, look, this story, I mean, it demonstrates, the failings basically at every level, as far as just investigating the crimes themselves, whether it's the police or the prosecutors, and then the actual following through of victims' rights, making sure that we know when the court dates are coming, making sure that they have the right to put in a victim impact statement, even if the case is, basically concluded in a way that the victim doesn't approve of.
Right.
That was really the thing that kind of impressed me the most about Keith. Even just when he was talking about, how it was never his intent to throw the alleged perpetrator away. He didn't seem very vindictive or retributionary at all. It was more so just like, look, if you don't do something to hold this kid to account and connect him with, you know, actual treatment and actual state oversight, then he's going to keep doing this again. And I mean, it's looking, again, allegedly, like that his prediction basically came true.
I know that Keith mentioned, his displeasure with the local police department in Cheshire. He was frustrated with all the way up to the Attorney General's office, with judges, attorneys. You mentioned communication. I know we can't obviously cover all of these different elements, which you do a fantastic job laying out these various elements of the story in the investigation at insideinvestigator.org. But there are some structural elements that I don't think people might understand quite as well. And if you're up for it, I'd love to have you explain what AR is, accelerated rehabilitation, and when that tool is used, and also I guess what happened in this situation. Could you kind of take us through those levels?
Yeah, so accelerated rehabilitation, it's a diversionary program, and essentially what diversionary programs are, I think most people would be familiar. It's kind of a buzzword at this point, but it's essentially when the court looks at a case and they deem it to be, a first time offense typically, or something not rising to the level of like, okay, this guy is a serial killer, we need to lock him away, or he's a repeat offender of violent crimes, we need to lock them away. It's essentially a way for the courts to look at somebody's record, assess them, and say, okay, this is your first time offending. We are not going to stuff an already overcrowded jail, full of people like yourself. And we're not going to spend more of the court's time prosecuting this case when it's clear you're a first time offender. So what we're going to do is connect you with typically programming or counseling, and you're essentially like on probation, and you have to complete some sort of state approved or court approved, because as we've seen in previous audits, oftentimes court approved isn't state approved, but that's a whole other story.
That's worth talking about, and
Yeah,
we should include the in the show
yes,
notes a link to that article as well. What he's
yes,
alluding to, just from the 30,000 foot level here, is that there isn't a clear understanding and of what programs are acceptable
yeah,
in some cases, and there have been situations where people have had to go out and find their own programs, and they've basically been taken advantage of. It's bad on both sides. It's
yeah.
predatory, and it doesn't satisfy the beneficial goals of not sticking someone in jail for all of those other expenses. So sorry, continue there
No,
though. That was,
you're good.
I think that's an important article that you wrote.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
But yeah, it's essentially, we view you as someone who can be helped more and rehabilitated outside of, the typical criminal justice route. So we're going to connect you with resources. We're going to essentially put you on probation. And if you can show to us that you've completed these counseling, yada, yada, support groups, whatever the court deems is necessary, then you'll essentially leave without going to jail. And Keith told me, he's like, look, I'm a supporter of the idea of this, but it's just kind of it's created somewhat of a perverse incentive. So you see this, I mean, I'm originally from New York, so a lot of people complain about bail reform in the state of New York, right?
Yep.
But when you really look at it, it's baked into the law, at least in New York it is, that the judges are the ones with the discretion. So they can say,
Gotcha.
if we think that, if we have reason to believe, even if this isn't a serious enough crime to rise to where we'd be mandated to have cash bail, we still have the discretion to, if you've committed the same, petty crime 15 times in a row, we can hold you for cash bail. And so people are kind of don't attribute the blame to where they should. And I think it's the same thing going on here, where Keith kind of spelled it out for me. It's like, it says very clearly in the law that accelerated rehabilitation, as is the case with a lot of other diversionary programs, is the judges are essentially supposed to consider, A, is this a first time offense? You're not supposed to get it on a repeat offense, basically ever. And B, what is the likelihood, look at all the evidence and assess the likelihood that this person is going to repeat their offense.
Yeah.
And Keith, he had these allegations from a former classmate of his saying, look, this guy has done this thing before. He's been accused of doing it 3 times before when he lived out in California. Nobody ever investigated that. Nobody ever picked up on that. So that's essentially, it just wasn't ever in the court record. And so the judge didn't have that to look at and say, hey, yeah, there is a likelihood that this person is going to be a repeat offender. And so they issued the accelerated rehabilitation. And you see that a lot throughout the state, I think, just in regards of, at least Keith was saying, judges and prosecutors kind of looking at this as a program really to just expedite the court process, look at it as a chance of, okay, we don't have to take this to trial. We can clear off our dockets. You get an AR, you get an AR, everybody get an AR. That way we can focus on the cases we want to, or we can clear off some of this burden because our docket's getting too full. And so it's not really being used in the way that it is mandated or statutorily supposed to be used. It's used as a way to save everybody time and,
Right.
yeah.
Which, I mean, on the other side, we know that there are a huge number. I mean, if you look at just the growth of what constitutes a crime and the types of things that courts need to handle, that list has grown exponentially. So it's not
Yep.
surprising to me that the system is overburdened with just taxing tasks, right? This reminds me too of Catherine's plea bargain investigation from, it was a while ago now, and the numbers have not gotten any better, where a huge number of cases just end in plea bargains. So, there's a perverse incentive, as you put it, to take a plea bargain when you might get the book thrown at you for wasting the court's time, right? I think we need to remember we talk about being, humans as journalists, but the same goes for every single state employee, every single judge, every single attorney who's involved in this. They want to go home to their families at night, and when you have what to you seems like a reasonable deal being proposed, and someone rejects it and wastes your time, we've seen judges take that harder approach, and it seems like a vicious cycle. Um, but also to throw out there, this is not a single-edged sword, because as we're this investigation talks about, there are allegations that this individual, and I don't want to get too far into this in the limited time we have. I want people to go read this investigation, but there's an allegation out there that this individual went on to threaten another teenager with a knife, murder another individual, and then get away with an unknown number of other damages to real human beings out there. And, we aren't here to sit and say, hey, here's how this should have been handled, or here's the perfect solution. Though, Brendan, I know you have the perfect solution to this, just waiting to say it. You have to hold it back because it's not our place. It really is, at the end of this, our job is to bring this information forward. And I am curious, right? Whether it's in the comments here, in the comments on the investigation, or someone battling this out somewhere, when we bring this forward, it's not just to put pen to paper and spill ink. There's a very important question here about how corruption should be handled and dealt with. We can root it out, but at that point, there's a very open question about how these things need to be handled. Let me ask you this. This is a question I want to start asking every one of our reporters on every one of these episodes, because we talk about our mission, but I don't think we tie our stories back to our mission in the public eye probably as much as we should. We've talked a lot about the definition and how we each have kind of differing perceptions of what constitutes corruption, whether that's legal or et cetera. But in your words, how does this investigation, how does your work on this piece advance our mission to root out corruption?
Well, I think when you really boil it down to its simplest essentials, in my view, I think corruption is just betrayal of the public trust. If you or someone you love has been the victim of a terrible crime, you expect, obviously no system can be perfect, but you expect to at least be treated as an equal by the criminal justice system. And we have the case of, in this story, not only Keith and his family, but of another family as well, who, they've both had experiences with the same individual. They've both went through the same criminal justice system, They both dealt with the same police department, and both of them left feeling, not only just dissatisfied at the outcome, but dissatisfied at the steps in the procedure that led to that outcome. And that's what I think is very important here, because from the onset, you might hear us talking about the story and think, oh, two families, they didn't get their way in court, so be it. This type of thing happens every day. And you would be correct, but we wouldn't just write this story if that was all it was,
Yep.
It's not so much that they didn't get the outcome they desired, because that's life. Sometimes you don't get what you want. It's just when you look at it and you look step by step at everything that they allege to have occurred with their interactions with the police, with their interactions with the prosecutors, with their interactions just with every agency and I guess rung of the criminal justice system that we have outlined here, it's procedurally just so flawed. They were not, I mean, Keith, nobody was satisfied with the way that the police investigated either of the issues here. Nobody was satisfied with, well, I guess it didn't even get to the court system in the case of Robin and her family, and that was their main complaint. So theirs really just lies with the police and the prosecutor's office, the state's attorney's office. But with Keith, I mean, it did get to the court system, so he wasn't satisfied with the police. He felt that they botched their investigation. He had examples of how, and he could draw on his own experience as a police officer to show. He was disappointed with just the way that he felt that he was lied to by the state's attorney's office with, they said they would offer him this and then they didn't. They said they would investigate these claims and then they didn't. They said that they would keep him updated on court dates and then they didn't. And it's just, that's really what is striking to me, is just that this is about the procedure. It's not about the outcome so much. Like it is, if if we didn't have such a terrible outcome, then we wouldn't have such a compelling story, unfortunately. I don't mean to say that sounds horrible to say.
No, you're good. I'd rather write boring stories if there was no ills in the world.
Exactly.
I don't think that's controversial. Your point is well taken.
Yeah, when you look at just all the failures and like what would seem to be basic procedure and what you would expect, that is where the corruption is, I would say, because you expect these public institutions to do their due diligence and treat you as equals, but oftentimes they do not.
Yeah, I agree with that. And, my 2 cents on that corruption piece and making sure that it's tied to our mission is, we're talking about very clear initiation of violence, very clear, diminishing of wealth by force or fraud, if for nothing else on that latter point by, requiring this lengthy years-long legal battle, and the heartache, the tolls that were taken on these families. Clarity has value in this stuff, and it would have been really nice, and we would write this story too. Hey, we had the best investigators in whatever police department. There was, holy cow, look how they went above and beyond to, not be corrupt and care for those who they are charged with protecting. I'll spare you my, police are not actually constitutionally required to protect you. We can have that particular SCOTUS conversation a different time, though it is important to know. Those kind of stories are powerful, the good and the bad. And, it breaks my heart when we have to write these. It's probably the hardest part of the job, in my opinion. I either, reading it, talking to these people, it's nice when we could get a positive resolution out of our investigations, but sometimes we have to publish the ones where it's kind of a dead end. And, it would be a real long shot for anything else to come of this. I want to just offer, just more praise for Keith as someone who, stands to lose something potentially by speaking up. Again, I think he did his due diligence to separate his state role and the reason that he was speaking to us, but I'm not going to pretend that working for the judicial branch and speaking critically about justice is an easy position to be in. He deserves credit for that. And just like everyone who's a whistleblower and a tipster, it is a courageous act, and it is an essential one. It's not just for making Connecticut a better place, but certainly in pursuit of our mission. As Brandon said earlier, we're not just poking around in people's bank accounts or getting crazy access to information. Our best stories come from people who stand up, take the time to compile information, are personally impacted in many cases, or know someone who has been, and then reach out to exceptional reporters like Brandon, who they know they can trust to do the right thing and tell the story. Brandon, anything else that you want people to know about this? Otherwise, of course, I'll throw out there again. It's called Disorder in the Courts. Two families struggle for justice, and you can find that at insideinvestigator.org.
Yeah. First and foremost, go read the story. I think it's a great one. Clearly, I'm biased on that on that regard, but if there is anybody who works for DCJ or the judicial branch who, may have some similar experiences or may take similar issue with how things are working or perhaps not working in their office, please feel free to reach out to me. You can reach out to our tip line. And you don't have to be you don't have to be as brave as Keith. That's the number one thing I want to put out there. That is I guess now comes the part where I sing my praise of Keith. What he did was like incredibly courageous. We are happy to work with anonymous tipsters, and we are happy to work out a blueprint on just how to make sure things do not blow back on you. So I guess that's really the only thing I want to, stand on my soapbox and yell from the rooftops, basically.
Absolutely. You can reach Brandon at brandon@insideinvestigator.org, or to reach our general tip lines where all of this information will end up eventually anyway. That's tips@insideinvestigator.org, TIPS. Brandon, thank you so much for taking the time today. Thank you to all of you who are supporting our work to root out corruption in the state of Connecticut. We are incredibly lucky to be a nonprofit that is entirely donor supported from people who believe in our mission. We take no money with strings attached, which is a beautiful way to be able to work, especially in the journalism space where so many are driven by red meat headlines and clickbait. We want to rise above and make sure that we are providing you with value. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Brandon, thank you so much again. We'll be back in 2 weeks, and until then, be well, stay safe, and stay informed.